little like Eamon, this is your life anyway, is how I feel. But it's a huge pleasure to be here to introduce Caroline at this professorial platform. Caroline's work became known to me as an MA student, as I'm sure it did to many of you in the audience today. She's an incredibly popular writer with students. And the book she wrote with Minna Thornton, Women and Fashion, A New Look, in 1989, was really, I think, in the vanguard of texts exploring the cultural meanings of fashion, along with Elizabeth Wilson's Adorned in Dreams. There was very little around to read at that time, so it proved something of a revelation to me. It demonstrated that it was possible to write about clothes and their meaning with passion, with vivid insight, and with political nous. I think part of the reason for that ability to deconstruct fashion's notoriously slippy coordinates in an accessible and an engaging manner must lie in Caroline's commitment to the Art and Design School as a locus for scholarship. She started as a visiting teacher in London College of Printing, as it then was, in 1987, and then taught at Middlesex and Goldsmiths during the early 1990s. And she started at Central St Martin's as a visiting teacher in cultural studies in 1990, becoming permanent in 1994, and how the years passed. Now, it was at about that time, in the mid-90s, that I got to know Caroline better, rather than just as the author of a book. I remember I invited her to lecture at the RCA, where I was a tutor at the time. I was convening a series on the body, and Caroline delivered a room silencing dissertation on Rabelais, Bakhtin, and the grotesque, and I was completely spellbound. Over subsequent years, I was honoured to be able to work with Caroline in the field as the field of fashion studies expanded inexorably, not least through the launch of the journal Fashion Theory in 1997. And in that first issue, volume 1, her article Dreams That Only Money Can Buy, or The Shy Tribe in Flight from Discourse, offered a characteristically insightful critique of the extant literature around subcultures. And it's absolutely apt that her article was there in the first issue of what's become an incredibly influential journal for the promotion of this sort of scholarship that we'll hear tonight. Alongside publishers like Berg, who publish Fashion Theory, of course, major funders, including the Arts and Humanities Research Council, as it was then, also offered a platform in the late 90s and early this century for the kind of innovative work that Caroline has been so good at pioneering. And her leadership of 2 phases of the Arts and Humanities Research Council funded Fashion and Modernity project here at Central St Martin's produced exhibitions, books, conferences, articles, and forms of practice that really shifted the discipline. They were both collaborative, supportive of individual scholarship, and Caroline especially was generous in her mentoring of PhD students and peers. If ever you want a tip on a good book or a good reference, Caroline is the person to ring up. She always has it spot on. So she's proved an inspirational leader and fellow academic. And during those years, the fashion and modernity years, her key work, Fashion at the Edge, Spectacle, Modernity, and Deathliness, she always has good titles, Caroline, very handsomely produced by Yale University Press, demonstrated that academic writing in fashion could be testing and provocative, often complex and labyrinthine in a good way, but also stunningly beautiful. She has a real eye for the material that illustrates her arguments, and the visual sits at the core of her practice. The ideas of that book worked through with the curator Judith Clark at MoMU in Antwerp and the V&A through the exhibition Malign Muses, When Fashion Turns Back, must rank, I think, as one of the most compelling examples of the perfect, and I apologise for this to those academics amongst you, but it really is the perfect impact case study that I know of. But of course, it was much more than that. It really offered a whole new way of theorising spectacle through the prism of fashion that was quite eerily predictive, I think. And I've been plagiarising Caroline ever since. She has some key phrases that are always incredibly useful when you're talking, writing, or thinking about fashion. The most evocative for me was her description of the way London thrives as a fashion city and the way the creativity comes out of the interstices of old derelict areas of the city and thrives. And so I've shamelessly ripped that off many, many times. So more recently, following the award of a Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship, Caroline has been touring the world, exploring the development of the fashion show as a symptom of constituents of modernist endeavour in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it promises, the project, when published by Yale University Press very soon, we hope to be as revelatory as all of her previous texts. And it's to the themes of that book and that research project, 3 years in the making, that Caroline's going to talk tonight. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be introducing it here. Professor Caroline Evans, The Modernist Body. Thank you.
When someone gives an introduction like Chris's, it makes the speaker almost incapable of speech because it's so touching. But it's also not quite true, Chris, because you were closely involved in fashion and modernity, and I don't think I could have done it without you. So Chris also played a very important role in that. I'm going to talk tonight about the research I have done for a book that's coming out about modernism and the first fashion shows. Before I start, I'd just like to quickly point out, I don't know if you heard as you were coming in, there was a sort of a soundtrack. There's some music collected for me by Callum Story, who found not just one, but 10 versions of Kraftwerk's Das Modell, including a reggae one, a Chinese one, and one by the Balanesco Quartet. So I hope you'll be able to hear them in the foyer on your way out, if you didn't on the way in. And I'm going to put up a playlist at the end. So yeah, don't all stampede now. So the lecture today, sorry, I should have moved it on, is a broad overview of my research for a book on the history of the earliest fashion shows in the US and France, from about the 1880s, but really from 1900 to 29. But it's an overview that for tonight I tried to synthesize into 3 principal arguments about the body in the fashion show. And the book ranges quite far and wide beyond the fashion show, so I suppose one of the things it tries to do is contribute to debates about modernism, as well as to tell this rather little-known history of the fashion show. And I hope you've all got a copy of the publication designed by Phil Jones, and this is the cover design. Instead of publishing the text of this lecture, I chose to assemble a small collection of fairly typical primary sources that are in the book. And so some of them are in the lecture and some of them aren't. But I hope that you can enjoy looking at it afterwards as a supplement to, rather than a summary of the lecture. And it's a kind of collage of written and visual sources to which Phil has given equal weight. So on every double-page spread there's a text and an image, which I've juxtaposed, and Phil has grouped them for me under the three subheadings of tonight's lecture: mechanisation, motion, and the missing part, that you also see here in the black type behind the modernist body in white. And I oscillate between thinking this modernist body is actually 3 different bodies, or as Phil's design suggests, it's a single body, but with 3 shadows. A rationalized body first of all, and then a mobile and gendered body, and finally a missing body, or perhaps more accurately, one which lives invisibly below the radar of historical investigation, so perhaps missing from history and even from consciousness. So before I jump into that, I'm going to really briefly sketch some of the history, the bare bones history of the fashion show, because so little of it is known, and it really is 50 years in 5 minutes or 10, so hold on to your hats, and it's just to set the scene. These are buyers at Doucet in 1923. Most historians agree that Western fashion is now 700 or 800 years old, but the fashion show is much younger. It's only about 112 years old. It starts around 1900. And its development is closely linked to the emergence of the haute couture system of fashion production and sales in the mid-19th century, when many French fashion firms were networked to sort of global, or part of global trade networks across Europe and the Americas. And this isn't information that you'll find in most books about haute couture, which like to stress its elite status as a provider of top-end clothing to a few rich women. And you may even have read that couture was a sort of laboratory for ideas, a kind of powerhouse of innovative design. But in fact, it was much more innovative, principally, in its ways of doing business than it was in design terms. And many famous couturiers weren't even designers, like Doucet here, who were brought in from freelancers. Paul Poiret started as a freelance designer selling to work from Doucet before opening his own house. So haute couture houses did make top-end clothing for individual clients, but they prioritized their international sales to manufacturers and wholesalers at all levels of the market. And they did that through the mechanism of the fashion show. The French garment trade was an export trade, but quite an unusual one, in the sense that it sold not goods but ideas in the form of model dresses, that's a one-off dress, a dress design. So the buyers that you see, or the buyer in the bottom left here, at Doucet, if he bought this dress, he would acquire not the dress that the model is wearing, but a prototype, perhaps with additional fabric and trimming samples, and he would buy the rights to reproduce it for a limited period in his own country, but not in France, because they wouldn't sell to the French, couturiers wouldn't sell to the French. And you can see the saleswoman here possibly taking an order. So it was for the convenience of these overseas buyers and not the private clients that the fashion show evolved. And clients and buyers were kept strictly apart in separate shows. Right up to the 1920s, the couture houses were extremely secretive about these trade shows, preferring to advertise their exclusivity and suggesting that haute couture was an art, not a trade. And Nancy Troy writes very illuminatingly about that in her important book, Couture Culture. And in fact, this colour film footage from 1923 is highly unusual in showing trade buyers, because most newsreels focus on the show rather than the audiences. The fashion show itself developed around 1900, but fashion modeling preceded it by several decades, and even before then, in the 18th century, French dressmakers had sent fashion dolls, like this one on the left, it's from the Museum of London. They would send dolls like this round Europe to advertise their fashions. And the theme of the fashion model as a kind of mechanical doll or automaton haunts her image from the earliest days. And on the right-hand side is the earliest photograph of a fashion model that I found, or one of the earliest, at Redfern in Paris in 1898. But the first visual illustration of these living mannequins, as they're called, and I should say the model usually refers to the model dress, and the woman we today call the model was called a living mannequin. And she's first illustrated in the 1880s, and I'll come back to that decade later to talk about the rationalization of the body. But this slide also heralds my second theme, the body in motion. And here the mannequin is depicted in vivid and even quite unrealistic movement, as she models a tennis pose for the client who has requested a garment in which to play tennis and croquet. So the dress is a Parisian jersey, as it was called, and it's made from stretchy knitted fabric, and what we see here is in fact an early form of sportswear being modelled by the new breed of fashion professionals from the 1870s to 80s, the full-time fashion model. But it took another 30-odd years before the fashion show proper evolved. The fashion shows started to be held in both Paris and America in the first decade of the 20th century, but the very first fashion shows started here in London, where Lady Duff Gordon, trading as Lucille, pioneered them in the late 1890s. So the image on the left shows a modelling stage with chiffon curtains that she built in her Hanover Square premises. And she styled and trained her mannequins to walk and pose haughtily. She turned the event into a cross between a kind of elite party and a theatrical event, sending out engraved invitation cards and serving tea. But Lucille is really important to the story of international fashion because in the second decade of the century, she became the first designer with branches in 2 continents, 3 capitals and 4 cities. That's London, New York, Paris and Chicago, each time using her spectacular fashion shows to launch her new branch. Poiret on the right-hand side was also important and innovative. This is a fashion show in the garden of his Paris couture house in 1910. And like Lucille, he disguised the commercial side of his business and his American sales, but he also took the precaution of banning anyone from his shows who didn't buy anything. French fashion shows were by invitation only. They were extremely hard to get into, and audience sizes were in the tens. They were quite small, so something like 60 would have been a very big audience. Whereas in America, by contrast, American shows were conceived on an absolutely huge scale, often held in department store theatres and halls like this one in Wanamaker's famous Egyptian Hall in its Philadelphia store. And the audiences of these shows were in their thousands. They were open to the public, to anyone who could afford the price of a ticket. So they were much more about show business and retail, whereas French shows were targeted at wholesalers and manufacturers, with entry by invitation only and no members of the public. Where the French public and visitors to Paris would see the new fashions was generally at the Paris races, an important parading ground for fashion, where mannequins were sent by their employers generally to cause outrage and to be photographed. And these photographs would be syndicated around the world. So, in fact, what was considered scandalous about these particular mannequins was they're wearing side-slit skirts that are slid almost to the hip, and they have very diaphanous skirts underneath, through which you could see the view of their legs as they walked. And one of the things I found out was that it wasn't Poiret who first sent mannequins to the races with these side-slit skirts, as he claimed. It was the firm, little-known firm today, Marguerite Lacroix. Gradually, the French industry learned to exploit the commercial possibilities of publicity through the fashion show, and they started to stage shows, for example, on the big ocean liners that went from France to America. After the war, French couturiers continued to use the fashion show to sustain their foreign markets and to secure their presence on the international stage. So Jean Patou, whose mannequins are top left here, visited America in 1927 to recruit these American mannequins to his Paris catwalk, while Paul Poiret, down the bottom, toured Europe with his French mannequins that you can see, and in these coats were green, quite garish, green and yellow stripes, and sometimes they wore them over really loud, sort of loud houndstooth blazer jackets. And you see pictures of them over about 3 years in these coats, in Berlin, Vienna, Copenhagen, Stockholm, and as the years pass, their hemlines rise. So then, as today, these couturiers understood the vital role the fashion show played in international marketing and promotion, not just sales. So when Patou's mannequins, here on the top left, debuted in Paris in February 1925, alongside their French colleagues, Patou opened the show by sending out a long line of 20 to 25 mannequins dressed in these identical cotton wraps that were normally worn backstage between fittings, to much amused applause. And Patou's line of identically dressed mannequins filing through the salon in their check wraps must have looked like some kind of modernist abstract pattern in motion. Imagine Marcel Duchamp's painting of the nude descending the staircase, but animated and dressed in geometric checks. So the image brings me to my first theme, the rationalization of the body. Patou and Poiret's modernist checks and stripes are two modest examples of how in the 1920s fashion show, the individual human body, organic, palpable and fleshly, was both abstracted and made over as mechanical through its styling and scenography. But in describing the stripes and the fashion show too as modernist, I don't really mean the artistic modernism of the avant-garde, so much as the modernism of the rationalization of the body across several fields, both progressive and conservative. For while the fashion show borrows the visual pattern of modernist art for its effects, its real links are to the rationalized body of work, leisure, and popular culture. 14 years earlier, Patou had staged his very first fashion show in 1912, in which he presented his mannequins in chorus line formations that are illustrated here in this composite magazine photograph at the bottom. So that's Patou's first ever show. The middle image illustrates a parade of fashion mannequins of Doucet, who you've already seen, this time in 1913. And the top image shows how the sort of graphics and layouts of fashion magazines began to adopt this fashion show format. It's a composite photograph, which is a review of the previous year's fashions from a fashion magazine of 1911. In addition to presenting their mannequins in these lineups, French couturiers sought to streamline the mannequins' bodies in other ways too. They controlled their diets and even paternalistically their way of life as much as they could. And I've included in the booklet a long quotation. It's actually from Doucet, although it doesn't say that, but it's from the article accompanying this middle illustration, where Jacques Doucet describes the vegetarian diet that he puts all his mannequins on in the weeks leading up to the fashion show in order to improve their complexions and control their weight. And I read another more extreme article that talked about diets of oranges, which I hope was not true. Doucet in this article refers proprietorially to the mannequins as his stable, and something of this attitude prevailed at Poiret too, who in 1911 toured Europe with 6 mannequins dressed in identical beige and navy uniforms. There are no surviving pictures of them, but you see the stripy coats his mannequins wore on tour in the 1920s, and these uniforms too had the effect of making the mannequins look like a troupe of identical performers. So in all these ways, the fashion model begins to be styled to resemble the chorus girl in line. And in the post-war period, designers increasingly stage-directed and costumed their fashion shows to form abstract patterns and blocks of colour on the catwalk in ways that prefigure the films of Busby Berkeley, using streamlined abstraction to turn individual bodies into moving patterns. What Siegfried Krakow called the mass ornament in his 1927 essay of that name, where he argued that the chorus line was a symbolic representation of capitalist production in the way it mimics the production line. In other words, the sphere of leisure, and in that, the production that is going on in the factory. I'm not going to read these quotes in full because they are actually in the booklet, but Krakow makes a link between the girl in the chorus line and the commodity form, when he writes that these products of American distraction factories are no longer individual girls, but indissoluble girl clusters whose movements are demonstrations of mathematics. And at one stage I wanted to call the book The Mathematics of Fashion, although it didn't quite work. And Walter Benjamin calls the chorus girl a mass-produced article in the libidinal life of the big city dweller. Krakow's descriptions of the chorus line apply equally to the uniform appearance of the mannequins in the fashion show lineup that subsumed individuality into a mass ornament. The effect was augmented by the mirrored decors of the couture houses that multiplied the mannequins' images to infinity. So here at work, this is rather a complex picture. On the left, you see the mannequin walking forward through a series of interconnected salons, which is, I'm told, called an enfilade, where you have a series of openings on axis. So you get the real recession in space behind the mannequin, and then to the right of her figure, you see exactly the same framing device, but you have mirrored glass in it, opposite another mirror, which creates the illusion of infinite recession there. And then you've got more mirrors. If you look on the the left-hand side of the image, you can see that just between the two windows, you've got more mirrors set into the walls of the room, so that you get the mannequin's reflection again over there on the left of the image as you see it. So it's a much more complex photograph than you think at first glance. And this pervasive use of mirrored panels and walls in couture houses guaranteed that a single mannequin could be multiplied in the mirrors to resemble a kind of chorus line of mannequins. So in the realm of representation, the couture house interior was a kind of production line of images of individuated luxury consumption, and reflected images like these constituted the optical unconscious of the fashion industry. The multiplied mirror image of the solitary mannequin is an analogue of the replication of the model dress in the factories of the New World. And in fact, the peculiar status of the model dress, which is closely guarded and never leaves the couture house, is very like Walter Benjamin's description of the photographic negative in his essay on the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, because it's a kind of non-original that nevertheless engenders a multiplicity of copies, i.e. the mass-produced dresses. In its entirety puts into question the very idea of an original. And of course, again, Nancy Troy has written illuminatingly on this question of the original and the copy in both modernist art and fashion of this period. So, it's in all sorts of ways like these, I argue, that the fashion show rationalizes the body to make it both modernist and productive. It uses a range of regulatory, visual and corporeal techniques, some of which I've just shown you in images, so they include diet, modelling styles, uniforms and mirrors. And all this in the period before the First World War suggests that while the aesthetics of dress design may not yet be modernist, the fashion show itself emphatically is from its inception, in both concept and scenography. This rationalization of the body, however, is not a product of modernism and has earlier antecedents in military parading, as well as in the increasing mechanization of factory work in France from the 1880s, the decade in which you'll remember the first mannequins are pictured too. So I'm afraid rather tiny little Napoleonic military parade on the left disciplines bodies to eradicate all trace of individualism. And looking at the image on the right, in the 1880s, the physiologist Etienne Jules Marais devised his system of chronophotography, which he used soldiers walking and running to analyze human movement. And more pertinent to the fashion show, this technique was still in use in France in 1913, the period of those first fashion show lineups that I showed you a few slides ago. These images of military gymnastics show a single body in motion, using multiple pictures to map the movements of one individual in space and time simultaneously. The chorus line formations of the fashion show in 1913 share with these images a concern about how to capture the image of the body in motion. In addition, they suggest commonalities between the ostensibly different bodily disciplines of fashion modelling and military parading that have 19th century precedents, as the French historian Georges Vigarello identifies in his history of the pedagogy of bodily gesture and comportment. And Vigarello notes the similarities between the bodily stances required by early 19th century military gymnastics and those of fashion. Indeed, the French word for a fashion show, le défilé, is also the word for a military parade. And in 1913, the coexistence of both kinds of défilé in the form of military gymnastics and the fashion show demonstrate how two entirely different regimes of state power and private enterprise respectively nevertheless share a common visual language in the standardized body. And this type of synchronic mapping, I mean, when I do this type of synchronic mapping across culture and society of the mechanized body, produces unexpected synergies too elsewhere. And just to give you one example, from around about 1900, one of the things the Parisian model was most famous for was her very unusual gliding walk. She didn't appear to be walking at all. She seemed to just glide along. And it's a walk that resembled the gliding motion of the moving platform at the 1900 Paris exhibition that took visitors round the perimeter at two speeds, 4 and 9 kilometers an hour, the speed of both fast walking and slow strolling. And in my book, in fact, I link these two speeds to two different speeds of city walking. The hurrying passant, who's a sort of scurrying working girl from the garment, well, not always from the garment industry, and the slow flaneur. So two Parisian literary types whose urban perambulations I explore in relation to the fashion mannequin and her profession of walking. So just as the rationalized body could span both fashion and soldiering, so too could new kinesthetic sensibilities at the turn of the century bridge such disparate spheres as engineering and fashion modelling, in the way that both lost their, if you like, specialist nature when they entered popular culture as new forms of spectacle and entertainment in world fairs and new media, particularly film. Not only was the mannequin famous for her gliding walk, but her entire performance was considered mechanical. Indeed, fashion journalists at the time describe her as if she is a strange new kind of machine. She makes repetitive gestures, they write, she has a robotic walk, and even an industrial smile. She takes her name, the living mannequin, as they very reluctantly call her, from the inanimate mannequin, the wicker or wooden dressmaker's dummy seen here on the left at Maison Félix. And she inherits the mannequin's neutral gender. In French, she's le mannequin, although she's nearly always a woman. And as Colette pointed out in a really beautiful text on the mannequin that I put at the end of the booklet, her gender is uncertain linguistically, and Colette observes that her ambiguous profession confers ambiguity on her. At Maison Félix in 1900, the living mannequins that you see on the right here worked alongside their inert counterparts shown on the left, and indeed in these images they seem to have traded characteristics. The living women on the right have the glassy eyes and rigid arms of the dummy, while the real dummies on the left are unusually lifelike for the period, with wax faces, real hair and glass eyes, so much so that I think their lack of arms is quite sinister. And there's a literary precedent to the mechanical nature of the first fashion models. In Villiers de l'Isle Adam's novel of 1886, so we're back again in the 80s, Eve of the Future, or Le Futur, which has provided a kind of foundational text for me. The novel describes the creation of a female android by a fictional Thomas Edison for an English aristocrat who has fallen in love with a woman who is beautiful but worthless. And the android is intended to correct her defects and become his ideal companion. So in the booklet I juxtaposed, in fact, this quotation, the description of the android first coming to life, with the photograph you saw earlier, the first photograph of the fashion model. And Villiers' novel is a kind of Stepford Wife story with a kind of Blade Runner twist. So the beautiful android gradually and poignantly begins to acquire some human characteristics. And this oscillation between human and inhuman, so common in both fiction and film about the creation of an artificial woman, always underlies the descriptions of the fashion model, who in the popular imagination inhabits the gaps between life and death, organic and mechanical movement, and object and subjecthood. Sometimes she is quite literally an object. In this left-hand image, the couturier Valles is sketching an embroidery idea for a jacket onto the muslin, and he's using the mannequin's body as if it's a kind of drawing board. He rests it on her torso. Similarly, in the bottom right image, mannequins were required to stand still for hours while dresses were fitted on them. This is Redfern at work. I also put in a little description of the incredible tedium and boredom of standing for hours on end for this beautiful dress that's just going to be worn by a rich woman whose life is entirely different from the mannequins. Going back to the top left-hand image, passivity was very much a prerequisite of modelling, and so too was this black satin undergarment, called a sheath of fourreau, that you see on the left. It covered the mannequin from chin to wrist, and it was worn underneath the clothes being modelled, so you could slip them on and off easily. But the fourreau gave the mannequins an identical, uncanny look that was reinforced by the uniformity of their behaviour and appearance. So mannequins were distinctive both because they resembled each other, they were all made to look alike, but also because, as today in fact, they didn't look like other women. And this identical styling of their bodies too is part of what I call the rationalization of the body. Now, this front of house styling was mirrored in the backstage organization of the couture house, and I'm going to talk just briefly about the rationalization of the body in the world of work by looking at backstage production, particularly at the atelier system typical of French haute couture, in fact today still. So this is a sewing atelier at the House of Worth in 1927. All these images come from the same album. So the atelier, or workroom, was a kind of organic, semi-autonomous cell containing a group of specialist workers and repeated 10 to 15 times throughout the house. Over several floors, there were separate ateliers for packing, cutting, tailoring and drapery, ateliers specializing in skirts, bodices and sleeves, all made by differently trained seamstresses. So look at how young this girl is in the foreground of this picture. Apprentices started at 13, and by 16, a girl would be a fully trained skirt maker, sleeve maker, or bodice maker, but she would never learn how to make the whole dress. There were other types of atelier for embroidery, for trimmings, for photography, and as you see here, for sketching. Up in the attics, you can see the Paris skyline through the roof. And then in the basement, there were deliveries, the bureaucracy, the offices, and the wrapping atelier, which is here. And all these different aspects of the work were kept strictly segregated in different parts of the building. And as the couture houses grew in size, their organisation had to become more bureaucratic, and labour became ever more divided and specialised. So haute couture was called a luxury industry, but it was no less an industry for that. Here's another sewing atelier. The seamstresses were not allowed to move between ateliers, and the dress parts were delivered to them by the apprentices, who acted like human cogs in a vast machine. And this typical form of haute couture production anticipated Henry Ford's first moving assembly line by some decades. And it suggests an industrial model of production, even though the individual skills required in each atelier were craft skills, and often at a very high level. For one reason, the far lower wages in France meant it was actually cheaper to go on hand making rather than tooling up for industrial production, as they did in America, so America was far ahead of Europe in terms of the first factory-produced clothing. More than anything, however, the atelier system suggested a kind of tailorist efficiency, even before taylorism became popular in France in the 1910s. F.W. Taylor's system of scientific management of the workplace, as he called it, was designed to increase productivity by controlling the physical movements of workers. And it allocated to each worker a set of specific, repetitive physical tasks, and prohibited him from using his judgment or his technical knowledge in their completion. So the result was really to de-skill the workers and to make their daily work mechanical, repetitive, and boring. And some of this kind of divide and rule of the body was also a feature of French fashion design in the atelier system I've just described, in which no worker was ever capable of making an entire dress, but was instead condemned to endlessly remake the same garment part, a sleeve, a skirt, or a bodice. It's a bit like someone on a car plant continually making a wheel arch on a car production line rather than crafting the entire car. So this backstage regulation also mapped onto the mannequin, although she was one of the few privileged beings who was allowed to move between backstage and front of house. So here the work mannequins leave the dressing room, and they patiently wait in turn in the corridor prior to going into the main salon to model. And I put in the booklet a text on the monotony and repetition of modelling, where the writer emphasises the repetitive nature of the work. They make exactly the same gesture 20, 30 times, then they have to go back, get changed, come out, do the whole thing again. So here they are in the salon, back again. While the mannequin's languid poses suggested luxurious consumption, the mechanical exactitude of her gestures, repeated 100 times a day, each time as if for the first, hinted at the industrial underpinnings of the business, and at the potentially alienating quality of modern industrial processes backstage. Her repetitive and stylized modeling gestures incorporated her as a living part of the machinery of the couture house, a huge coordinated mansion of regulated and divided labour, just as the calibrated and standardized movements of the tailorist worker made him a mere cog in the scientific management of the workplace. So this rationalization of the body is paralleled in other fields of cultural and economic production, and this is a bit of a shorthand slide, but I just wanted to highlight that you find in work, in leisure, and in art. So from the tailorist organisation of the couture house on the left, to the uniform performance of the chorus girl I put in the middle, to the automated and mechanical bodies of art, particularly in work of sort of high modernists like Duchamp, who in this particular image, of course, was looking at the chronophotography that I showed you earlier. So, so far, so modernist. In ways like this, the fashion show, I argue, does more than simply reflect modernist sensibilities, it plays its part in their constitution. So my project involves rethinking modernism through the agency of the body as both performative and gestural. And that means finding the sources of modernism not only in texts, images and objects, but also in performances, habits, routines and sensibilities, be they mainstream or avant-garde, as well as in new technologies and new cultural forms such as film, popular dance and sport for women. So readers of fashion magazines like Femina would turn the page from an image of, say, Patou's first fashion show to images like these of sport and dance. And these two from 1914 both show an interest in how to represent movement using chronophotography on the left, a sort of edited version of it, to show the gestures of the tennis champion. And on the right you see a border of film strip-like images from this article on how to do the new fashionable dances, the tango and the one-step. So, self-evidently, unlike Duchamp's nude descending a staircase, unlike the photos of military gymnastics, these images, like the fashion show, are images of women rather than men in motion. New iterations of modernity, these sporting, dancing and modelling women at the start of the 20th century are paradigmatically modern, not just modernist. The fashion model in particular made the idea of fashion as a form of perpetual motion seem quintessentially contemporary. For the fashion show is not only about the rationalization of the body, but also about movement and modernity, at a time both when the emancipation of women was on the horizon and when a sense of modernity became particularly associated with speed and acceleration. And of course there's any number of people on that. I suppose I had in mind writing by David Harvey and Stephen Kern. If the fashion model had started life in the 19th century as a kind of automated human being or a clockwork woman, in the 1910s she appeared to come fully alive. No longer haunted by her prehistory as a static object, in the pre-war years that ghost was laid as she transformed into a walking, dancing subject. Indeed, one who often troubled those of her contemporaries who worried about the changing role of women in the modern world. And there are many, many ways to examine this transformation, but tonight I'm going to do just simply by one example by looking at how the fashion designer Jeanne Paquin designed tango dresses for a mobile, modern body. Paquin launched her tango fashions here in London, where she already had a branch, at the Palace Theatre in November 1913. That's why this is written up in a Newcastle newspaper. The tango dress required movement to show it off. Hence the important role of specialist mannequins trained to walk gracefully in the narrow, clinging gowns of the day. But in addition to showing the dresses on tangoing mannequins, as she did, Paquin also rethought her design methods in these dresses. Rather than requiring the mannequin to stand immobile for hours in the traditional way while a dress was cut on her, as you saw in that image with Redfern sort of prodding the mannequin with his stick, Paquin asked her mannequins to move about in the models as she designed them. So she had them dance, walk around, sit and stand, so that she could correct all the design faults that movement revealed. Paquin called this a quest for a very 20th century allure, she said. She wanted to retain the extremely narrow skirt that was then fashionable, but still to give the wearer free movement. And to achieve that, Paquin said, we asked our mannequins to really live, vivre réellement in French. Walter Benjamin described the advent of new velocities that gave modern life an altered rhythm. And in the 1910s, the desire to see women's fashion in motion flourished on both sides of the Atlantic. Tangoing, slithering, swaggering and undulating her way across the modelling stages of London, Berlin, Vienna, Paris and New York, the living mannequin or mannequin vivant at last came properly alive. No longer a living doll, but an animated woman. She follows Paquin's injunction to really live. But it was as a silent woman performer that she really lived, one whose body was a speaking gesture, and in this sense her performance shared the characteristics of the new generation of actresses of the silent cinema. Actresses such as Asta Nielsen, who turned their backs on 19th century theatrical acting styles to create a new cinematic acting language of expressive movements of the entire body, so no more large gestures, but more acting with the body. It's no accident that the fashion show developed in tandem with that most transformative new form of moving image culture, film. It almost directly parallels it. Indeed, if the living mannequin can be said to be the animated body of modernism, the fashion show is a film strip of modernist sensibilities, and the conduit through which the mannequin enters the flow of early 20th century imagery. In 1925, Lucien Lelon announced his new concept of cinematic design, later changed to kinetic design, with this manifesto-like advertisement in French Vogue. Bordered by film strip illustrations of a woman engaged in fashionable day and nighttime pursuits, motoring, horse riding, walking, golfing, shooting and dancing, Lelon's advertisement announced that movement was the characteristic trait of modern life, and therefore a modern garment must be inspired by dynamism and designed for movement, as if that was new. So he calls his new kind of design cinematic design and compares it to the development of a film in slow motion. This way, he says, he'll create a form of dress suited to the gestures of modern life. And he presented these new designs at an innovatively staged fashion show that opened as if it were a film, with mannequins seen moving behind a large screen from which they presently emerged dressed in Lelon's kinetic clothes. The clothes themselves were nothing new, the so-called new movement being accommodated by very traditional kick pleats and inserts. But if Lelon's advertising campaign was spin, it was spin based on an understanding of the important role of mannequins as embodiments of the abstract concepts of movement and modernity. As French Vogue wrote in October 1925, the harmonious rhythm of the female body should henceforth no longer be ignored. So alongside the rationalized body emerges a second and gendered body, newly animated as an avatar of future sensibilities. On either side of the wall, syncopation and rhythm produced a swing and looseness to the body. Fluid tango dresses moved to the music in 1913, and beaded chiffon dresses to the foxtrot in the 1920s. And a sense of possibility was articulated in patterns, matrices, and flows, moving between flesh and fabric, sound and vision, commerce and culture. Thinking about kinesthetics at the turn of the century, therefore, involves thinking not only about machines, movement and modernity, but also about bodies, practices, spaces and subjectivities. And as I researched this period, there began to emerge a third body that didn't entirely fit my thesis about rationalization and movement, and which troubled the neatness of those interpretations. To my surprise, I found that the figure of the early 20th century fashion model threw up an unresolved contradiction about the modernist body and its other, a body which in some ways escapes the discourses that construct it. It was a body of which one could read the traces of subjectivities, of daily life and its vicissitudes, of gesture and physicality, something more to do with lived experience than with representation, but which perhaps could only be understood through representation. And this, of course, is the missing part. And it's complicated because there are, I think, two missing bodies. Firstly, there's what's actually missing from the historical record. So I found just enough information to be tantalized, but not quite enough to be able to draw any very sound conclusions. And there are huge gaps in the record. One of many types of female worker in the Parisian garment trade, the mannequin's experience has gone unexamined by labor historians and cultural theorists alike. So that's how invisible the mannequin is to us today. But secondly, the mannequin was invisible to her contemporaries too. I mean, not literally because she was spectacularly visible and much written about, but in the way that she figured as an abstraction rather than as a human being. So perhaps it's more accurate to say that she was missing from consciousness, something which may, by the way, explain why so little evidence of her working life survives. So turning first to her invisibility today, to the historian, the question is how to locate such traces, how to write the history of something as ephemeral as the walk, the pose, or even the facial expression, the fashion model's traditional look of bored disdain. There is, in fact, there isn't much on anything on fashion models, but there is a very rich and recondite literature of bodily movement and gesture, but rather than review that tonight, I've chosen instead to show you some of the primary sources that first sparked these questions for me. So I found these traces, for example, in descriptions of how the Paris mannequins couldn't get into work from the suburbs during the Paris floods of January 1910. And the buyers, who by now, American buyers, have all got used to coming to Paris and seeing fashion shows, complained how drab the clothes looked draped over chairs in the couture salons, rather than worn by the elegant mannequins. One of them wrote, "Mannequins without clothes, maybe, but clothes without mannequins, never." I found other such traces. I'm sorry, the colour's not great. It's actually a very beautiful pinkish mauve. I found other such traces of lived experience in the only 3 surviving dresses worn by mannequins in fashion shows that I could identify in archives. So 2 are in London, in the Museum of London, and this is in the Galliera in Paris. It's by Poiret, and it's very unusual. The curators say they know it's a model dress because you've got a colour swatch sewn into the hem, showing all the colours the dress would come in. And you've also got this printed label showing that it had been deposited in the French sort of trade offices in which copyright was registered. I found other traces in the written description of tiny modelling gestures. Again, a mannequin at Poiret. I'm sorry, just going back to this, I suppose one of the things that intrigued me about this was that there's a sort of indexical trace of the mannequin who actually wore this dress, and because there are so few, that's why I was intrigued. And then I read these descriptions of one of the stripy-coated mannequins in Copenhagen in 1925 modelling. She's called Raphael, and she's fast asleep on the chaise longue, and they wake her up at 11 o'clock at night. She has to stumble into the salon and model to all these evening, sort of guests dressed for evening wear. And she's fast asleep, and she models in these clouds of tobacco and drifts of perfume. And she keeps almost bumping into the tables, and every time she nearly bumps into the table, her chiffons quiver. So it was, in a way, the smallness of the detail that intrigued me. By an amazing chance, I found this text and image that could have been made for each other, Paquin again, although in fact they were published a year apart and in different continents. So the text describes how a modelling gesture, which is illustrated in the photograph, comes to define a house style. So, her pretty fingers are employed in fastening the collar, and this little habit of tucking it up with all sorts of pretty gestures is in effect a part of the Paquin silhouette. I found other small poignant facts about the clients, for example, that the popular actress Gabby Delis on her death had bequeathed various small legacies to the couture mannequins who had modelled for her all her professional life. And I found these pictures of a group of friends lunching in wartime Paris, clearly in high spirits, even though this was a very dark moment in the war, the period of the Battle of the Somme, with its appalling loss of life. And on the right you see Paquerette, aged 20, an actress and a mannequin, both for Poiret and his sister, the couturier Germaine Bongard. And she's described by André Salmon, who sees her in the company of Jean Cocteau, who took this picture. He says, Cocteau was in the congenial company of Paquerette, the most precious of Paul Poiret's mannequins, green shoes, a rosewood-coloured dress, and an indescribable hat. And this is the outfit that she wears in this picture that was taken just 2 or 3 days before the start of the August fashion shows. I found much sadder wartime accounts, such as one by an impoverished and oppressed Czech mannequin in Paris, describing a failed mannequin strike in 1916, anticipating the general strike of spring 1917 that started when 2 dressmakers walked out of the couture house of Jenny on the Champs-Élysées. This is my last example, but I read, for example, the excited account of the 16-year-old Latigue, who would lie in wait on these metal chairs in the Bois de Boulogne until a fashionable woman like this approached. And judging the distance carefully to take his photograph, Latigue would try to capture the precise moment she had her leg extended, so he could seize the fleeting moment that put the laws of gravity on hold. And I read many accounts of the mannequin walk and its evolution over the decades, including the fact that mannequins in the 1920s had 3 different walks for day wear, sportswear, and evening wear. So in all these fragments and traces, I began to get a glimpse of a different body, of the lived experiences of the mannequins, a little information about their salaries and conditions of work, a glimpse of their styles of walking and posing. A number of historians have engaged with the challenge of writing history from such fragmentary clues of bodies, gestures and sensibilities, notably Pierre Nora, who aimed to read the signs of a culture, he wrote, in places, objects and images that were marked by the past and remembered in the vicissitudes of contemporary consciousness. And other historians have suggested combining traditional historical methods with those of cultural anthropology and ethnography, sometimes a little bit dubiously, I think. But the dance historian Susan Lee Foster has written perceptively about what is at stake for the modern historian who cannot scream out her own kinesthetic empathy with the bodies of the past. And she suggests that the historian of bodies experiences through his or her own body a longing to find the vanished bodies of history, which she calls a proprioceptive affiliation between past and present bodies, an unofficial kind of identification not sanctioned by the methods of the discipline of history. And Foster revives the archaic term theory to combine theory and performativity in an interesting model of how to think bodies, as she calls it, and their meanings. But what if the body in question, to its contemporaries, didn't really have much meaning? So here's the final problem. Not really how to think the body, but how to think the body's invisibility. The very absence from history of many concrete details about the fashion model is telling. Her contemporaries seem to have taken their cue from her professional inscrutability and were more mesmerized by her facade than anything else. Again and again, they compare her not to the artist model, who you might think she's derived from, but to the figurante, a mute extra of the Parisian theatre, whose performance consisted simply of making gestures. And they compare her to the marcheuse, a female walker, a woman paid simply to walk on and off stage in the 19th century French ballet and café-concert. So these spectral women were employed simply to appear, to gesture, and to disappear. And out of such humble, anonymous, and almost invisible performance prototypes, the fashion magazine emerged into the full glare of 20th century publicity. Mannequins, like their 19th century stage precedents, were silent performers whose individual names were never credited in fashion programs or on theatre showgirls. In fact, they very often once even people didn't know their names in the way that they do today. When the British journalist Alison Seckel lunched in a London restaurant with Paul Poiret in 1920, he brought along 4 of his mannequins, splendidly dressed in green and gold uniforms worn with peaked caps. But every time the journalist tried to ask them a question, Poiret put a hand on her arm and interjected, "Do not speak to the girls, mademoiselle, they are not there." Well, of course they were there, was Seckel's comment. Poiret just meant they're not there socially because they're not respectable. True, they weren't. But I think they were there, paradoxically and improbably eloquent in their silence. As one astute journalist noted in 1913, their role was not to act the role of a person, but a thing. The journalist writes, rather than acting the role of someone else, the mannequins mime their own role, that's a static dummy, they mime their own role in the act of bringing the dress to life. Agents of transformation, their role was to animate the dress while effacing their own personality in the performance of a dress, to become a dress, if you like. They were almost tricksters. They even answered with the name of the dress when they were asked their own name, when they were spoken to. And this too, I've included a longer version of this in the booklet. So, you know, she's mechanical, etc. But when they say, the client says, "What's your name?" The client is talking to the dress, and the mannequin says, "I'm called Professorial," or whatever. So ultimately, the modernity of the mannequin lies in her paradoxical agency, whereby she constitutes herself as an object through the eloquence of her mute performance. And as such, she issues a challenge to several gender and theatre historians' analyses of visual culture and female autonomy in the modernist period. We should go back to the picture. In a period when the social and economic emancipation of women were the urgent and pressing questions of the day, however, what kind of agency can be attributed to women whose performance was so fleeting, so ambiguous, and so minimal? it would be easy to categorize the first mannequins solely as women who were objectified by the gender and economic inequalities of their day. Yet, while they obviously were objectified by those processes, in a way that would just be to objectify them all over again, double time. For they were also living women, and women making a living, even if their working lives are not covered by labour historians of the garment trade. Like actresses, mannequins were barely respectable, but unlike them, they were not celebrities. Mute figures who never spoke except to utter the name or price of a dress, they were nevertheless forceful visual icons, and to their contemporaries, their very capacity to void themselves of individuality or individual human characteristics made them a touchstone for concerns about femininity, even nationhood, class status, and sexuality. Ambiguous fusions of people and things, mannequins pose questions about the value of both. They were the commodity form at its most beguiling and disturbing. The mannequin could pass as a professional woman, as a society woman, and as a modern woman. It was above all in her staging of selfhood as a pose, her inauthenticity, her willed objectification, and her reification of her own image that the mannequin's modernity still has currency today. And these complexities continue to be relevant to contemporary debates about the intersection of women image, commerce, and culture. The history of the mannequin, and particularly her body shape, is topical still in today's size zero debates. The fashion show continues to stage commodity culture as spectacle, harnessing new technologies to older stagecraft as it goes. The way in which early fashion modelling was linked to parallel histories of the body in the spheres of work, leisure, consumption, and art gives us a model to think about how we continue to use our bodies to map both our dreams and anxieties in the cultural imaginary. The history of the fashion show is part of women's history, of business history, of design history, and even of intellectual history.
Thank you, Caroline, for a poetic, moving, and challenging characteristic really from you. We think we have a little time to take just a couple of questions, except we can't see you. If anyone has a question, they shout out or put their hands up. Yes, there's one.
Absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed that, Caroline. The walking and gliding really fascinates me.
Yeah.
Is there any film at all from that period?
Yes, a little bit. Not very much, and I think because film was still such a kind of popular format, I think the sort of higher level couturiers didn't want the cameras there. But the other main problem with very early film is we don't actually know. You can tell something, you're quite right, and you can tell different modelling styles, but it's not perfect because we don't actually know what were the right filming speeds and projection speeds. So you can't really tell a lot from early film, but as you get into the 20s you can tell more. But it's a really interesting question because I've actually got a whole chapter on the mannequin walk, and it's my favourite one. I mean,
well, there's some people going to demonstrate some of it.
You can come up and do that. One thing that was very interesting was how much richer the written sources and the journalism was in describing the war than in pictures or film. And so there's a whole kind of methodological, in quotes, problem there that is actually very interesting. Some people.
Wow. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Can you maybe can't, Caroline, unpack this, but the origin of the word of the term android? I'm interested in
That's another one.
In terms of it coming into the space that you're talking about, for example, where did you come across it first then?
I came across it in the Villiers novel, which he starts writing in the late 1870s, and he uses the French word for android. I mean, I have got an immense depth and detail into the origin of the word's mannequin model, but it never crossed my mind to look up android, so I'll have to go home and read about it.
I was just going to ask you what you managed to find exhibits came from, and I see them in different parts of Europe, is women turning up. They're obviously not mannequins because they're too big. But I wondered if you could look at me, what you thought about the relationship of that to this.
Well, I have looked at some film. What I found was that there is not very much until you get to the period of newsreel, and then there's tons, and suddenly, but it's more the kind of middle market French firm. So before the First War, it's not your Poirets people, although they're making their own film. But it's the kind of more middle market firms that are using the cachet, and particularly French department stores. So there is some newsreel footage. As you say, there's loads of film footage in archives that I just don't know what it was. Because my project is really about France, because of the sort of, that's where these couture model dresses are all being exported from, and then it's about America because that's the biggest market. And so the project is about the interface really of the sort of elite haute couture and then the mass market, mass production sort of global fashion. But so I haven't really looked at Britain very much, so I'm not sure I can really answer, and I don't know a lot, no.
One last question up the back.
It's just going back to the first question that was asked, and you mentioned that there were 3 different ways of models walking, one for day wear, one for sportswear, and one for evening wear. Could you only mentioned it, is there any chance that you can just sort of explain to us what the differences were?
I have to actually go back to my notes, because I can't remember, but I know that there are a lot of sources just say, oh, that, first they say each model has her own style, but then each one also has more than one walk. And often they're not described, but there is one very, very lengthy description. And it's quite interesting because it is about things like the length of the steps. I mean, it's quite, you could try and reproduce it from the description, I suppose. But I'm sorry, I just can't remember it all. It's quite a long book.
And yes, we should all read it. Well, there are drinks outside. That pink Poiret dress that you showed reminded me of a story when it was a hard day of editing, Fashion and Modernity, cold winter's day in the Borsborn Road. We were moaning about the politics of the workplace and how difficult editing was, and you had a bowl of lychees that were a beautiful pinky colour, and we were peeling lychees, and we said, yes, looking inside the lychees, and we said, wouldn't it be much better, much nicer if we could be florists? Or give it all up. But no, Caroline, I think tonight you've demonstrated that you'd have been